Honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I have to say I've found the third reading debate interesting, and indeed this whole process around the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement interesting. But I think I watched today as the governing Liberals and the opposition Conservatives and the separatist bloc all tried to take credit for free trade and sing the praises of free trade. And I can tell you, Madam Speaker, that the NDP is not here to sing the praises of corporate free trade. Far from it. We've been pretty consistent critics of this model of trade, not trade itself. And I think that's one of the sleights of hand that too often happens, not just in this place, but in the media, about trade, that somehow the corporate model of free trade that has been very good at reinforcing corporate rights over the rights of people and the environment is somehow the only way to do trade, Madam Speaker. We're not under that illusion. We know that too often corporate free trade deals have meant that countries get trapped in a race to the bottom, that these deals are structured in a way to allow international capital. And we hear this. I mean, we hear this in other debates, Madam Speaker, about how Canada needs to compete for investment, and if Canada tries to regulate in the public interest, if it has to do with the environment or if it has to do with workers, that international capital is going to leave, it's going to go to other jurisdictions. Well, these types of free trade agreements are all about making that easier and all about intensifying the threat of capital flight in the event that governments choose to stand up for their workers or stand up for the environment or stand up for the rights of Indigenous people within their territory, Madam Speaker. And CUSMA is unfortunately part of that model. What's different here is that we're not talking about going from no free trade agreement to having a corporate free trade agreement. What we're talking about here is two different agreements and which one we're going to have. And as some people have mentioned earlier, if we didn't go for the new CUSMA and the existing NAFTA was abrogated by the President of the United States, there would still be a free trade deal in place, the original free trade deal between Canada and the United States. So we're not in a position where we're talking about whether Canada is going to sign up for some new commitment under the corporate free trade agreement. What we're talking about is which commitment is going to serve Canadians better, and I think that's an important point to make, and I think that that's been a consistent theme throughout the debate on this, and certainly has been an important part of the NDP's deliberations on this particular deal. And so I had said in my second reading speech, Madam Speaker, that there were two questions that were going to guide us in our thinking. One was whether or not, on balance, this deal would leave Canadians better off than the current agreement. And the second question that I said would guide our deliberations was whether or not we could leverage the process around this deal, which we knew was going to pass anyway, because the Conservatives had said early on, whether they like it or not, whether they study it a long time or a short time, ultimately they were going to vote for it. So we knew that this was an agreement that was going to pass, and the question was whether we could use the process around this ratification in order to get a better process that made the next trade agreement negotiation more open and more transparent to the Canadian public. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the problems with the model, and then I want to talk a little bit about this particular agreement and why, on balance, we think that the package of things that comes with this agreement will leave Canadians a little bit better off than the status quo, Madam Speaker. In addition to the problems of the corporate free trade model that I mentioned earlier, particularly that race to the bottom when it comes to environmental standards and labor standards, the other problem is that we hear often from Conservatives that what they don't like about government is that it picks winners and losers, except that they have no problem with that when it comes to free trade agreements. They've negotiated and or signed. Actually, often they negotiate the deal and then the Liberals sign the deal. That actually seems to be the pattern. And those two parties work very well together when it comes to advancing this corporate model of free trade. But they don't have a problem picking winners and losers in free trade agreements, even though they don't like the idea of picking winners and losers when it comes to funding, for instance, renewable energy over other industries. That, they say, is an unacceptable picking of winners over losers. But when it comes to sacrificing the dairy industry in agreements. We know that they negotiated concessions on supply management in the TPP that ultimately the Liberals signed on to. I heard members of the Conservative Party, interestingly, and I think, you know, hopefully, optimistically, I was trying to listen in the best spirit, Madam Speaker, defending Canada Post, a Crown corporation, which is great to hear. Not very reminiscent of the way they behaved as a government, I might add, Madam Speaker, but it was nice to hear, and that was another instance where they were decrying picking winners and losers, and I'm inclined to agree that Canada Post shouldn't have been singled out because I'm a proud supporter of Crown corporations. I hope the Conservatives' resolve carries forward with them into whatever future positions they may have in this House, be it government or fourth party. We can only hope. I'd mention also that CUSMA picks winners and losers when it comes to the digital economy, and unfortunately I think the losers by and large are Canadians themselves. And this has been another feature of these corporate free trade agreements where governments, I think, quite needlessly tie their hands when it comes to making good public policy. One of the things that this agreement does is really constricts the options that Canadian governments have going forward for how to deal with what is a new and emerging and very important and significant aspect of the global economy, which is the digital economy. So for instance, in this agreement, the government has agreed that they won't make third-party platforms responsible for the content that is posted on those platforms. That's a major policy decision, Madam Speaker. It's one that we may well live to regret. It's a discussion that, in my opinion, should have happened in this House in a far more robust way outside of a trade. This isn't the kind of thing that we should have been negotiating with trading partners prior to having a meaningful debate about how Canada wanted to treat this issue. And, you know, in some places within trade agreements, you get protection for existing laws, rules, and policies. We really haven't had the opportunity to establish those in a meaningful way for many aspects of the digital economy, and we see a government already signing away its ability to make those decisions, and by extension, the ability of this place and of Canadians themselves to decide how they want their digital space managed going forward. But that is a feature of these kinds of agreements. It's the kind of thing that the NDP has been a vocal critic of, because we think that, you know, it's one thing to decide that you want to trade with another country. When you look at agreements like the Auto Pact, which were not global free trade deals, they were about dividing up the wealth that comes from producing those products and ensuring that the trading partners each were getting their fair share of the wealth generated by the products that were going to be moving freely across the border. That's not what free trade is. Rather, it's more about what I said earlier, which is setting up rules to make it easy for multinational corporations to move their production around. And that may have a short-term benefit on price, Madam Speaker, but doesn't always. We know that the market charges or companies charge what the market will bear. And in the long term, I think there are many Canadians who would appreciate the opportunity to pay a little bit more for a good or service that contributes to Canadian workers and keeps wealth in Canada. But I digress. I mentioned earlier that there were two questions that would guide our deliberations. I want to speak to the first one now, Madam Speaker, which is whether, on balance, this agreement is better than the status quo. And there are a few things that I would point to that I think, despite the faults of this agreement, are laudable. Number one is the elimination of Chapter 11 of the original NAFTA, which was the clause under which foreign corporations, not Canadian corporations even, although I wouldn't have been a fan of that, but I think it was that much more egregious that it only gave these rights to foreign corporations, could sue the Canadian government for creating laws or instituting regulations that protect the environment or workers that they saw as costing them profit. And Canada not only put this in the original NAFTA, but these investor state dispute settlement clauses have been in most of the trade agreements that we've negotiated, and Canada has paid out the most in the world under these kinds of clauses. So I'm glad to see that go. I note that it was actually something the President of the United States wanted gone, and that initially our government defended, which has always seemed pretty backwards to me, but nevertheless, regardless of who got it out, it is out, and that's a good thing. Likewise with the energy proportionality clause that said that if you take the average percentage of Canadian production of oil and gas that went to the United States over the last 3 years, for any year that you're in future years, the U.S. would have a right to insist on that percentage of Canadian production, regardless of whether it was a domestic shortage, regardless of whether or not we could get a better price somewhere else. The United States would have a right to that percentage of our production of oil and gas. We've always seen that as a completely unreasonable, to put it mildly, infringement on Canadian sovereignty and something that wasn't in the best interest of Canadians, and so we're glad to see that go. I note that there are a number of new North American content provisions for the auto sector, which we think are a good thing. They harken back, again, more to the auto pact, though. I mean, those provisions are actually least like free trade provisions, but they're being lauded as doing potentially the most for the Canadian auto sector, Madam Speaker, which I think is a signal that the free trade model in itself is not enough for Canadian success. One of the other things to note is that in the original version of this agreement, Madam Speaker, there was not the original NAFTA, but the original CUSMA. There were provisions that would have significantly increased the costs of biologic drugs and due, again, unfortunately not to our own government, but to the Democrats in the United States who went back to the table because they weren't satisfied with the original agreement. Those provisions came out. And so that means that some of the increases in the cost of prescription drugs that were going to happen as a result of this agreement, which we've seen in other agreements like CETA and the TPP, aren't happening in this agreement. And that's a good thing. And it's been one of the reasons that the NDP has often opposed some of these trade agreements, is because they offer unreasonably good protection to international pharmaceutical companies at the expense of Canadians who require medication to improve their quality of life. So that came out. We also saw first of their kind, again, and this was in the second round of negotiations spurred by the Democrats in the United States, we saw first of its kind labor provisions in a trade agreement. I won't say that they're perfect. I think there's a lot of work that's going to have to be done in order to ensure that they're implemented in a way that realizes the maximum potential for workers in Mexico. But these agreements would provide some upward pressure on wages for Mexicans working in the auto sector. And I think just as, or more importantly, and we heard this at committee from a Mexican member of the labor movement, that it will make it easier for them to organize real unions in their workplaces. And we know the evidence shows that when you have a union, you are able to get better working conditions and you are able to secure better wages. That's good for Mexican workers, but it's not just good for Mexican workers, it's good for workers in the United States and Canada as well. To the extent, and that extent remains to be seen, that it means that companies won't be picking up their operations and simply moving them to Mexico because it's a way of getting out of having a union in the workplace and getting out of paying higher wages. Again, this is not a panacea. It's not going to change things overnight. But these kinds of enforceable labor provisions are the kinds of things that New Democrats have said for decades ought to go hand in hand with the rules that are established and very strongly protected in international trade agreements. So what we are doing by voting for this agreement at this time is trying to consolidate the gains of having Chapter 11 eliminated, having the proportionality clause eliminated, having the potential increase in prescription drugs stopped. We want to give a chance to these first of their kind labor provisions to play out and to see whether we can use trade agreements to increase the fairness for workers. And I hope one day, too, if we can show that there's success on that front, that we could get meaningful enforcement of some environmental rules across jurisdictions, too. This agreement really doesn't do that. It doesn't mention the most important agreement designed to address the most important environmental challenge of our time, which is the Paris Accord and climate change. And I think that's where we're going to need to get if we're going to have accountability internationally for countries reducing their climate emissions. We need to tie those accords to economic accords as well, so that there can be meaningful consequences for countries who don't live up to their expectations. So I want to spend a little time now talking about the second question that I said would guide our deliberations on this matter, Madam Speaker, which was whether or not this process, this ratification process, could be leveraged to get a better trade process for next time. This process in itself was not great, Madam Speaker. We heard other members speak earlier about just how late Parliament got an economic impact assessment. So I think by everyone's admission, we're talking about a major deal. We're talking about a lot of trade crossing the border every day, and there's been a lot of commentary on the agreement. And the surprising thing, I think, for Canadians who may just be learning about this for the first time if they're watching at home, is that that debate wasn't supported by any real economic data, because the government didn't release it until the day before the end of the committee hearings, which was just last sitting Thursday, Madam Speaker. So the report, the economic report that actually puts some numbers to what we're doing here, came out on the Wednesday, and the committee study concluded and moved on the Thursday. So that didn't make a heck of a lot of sense. And there are other things that haven't made sense over the years, particularly, Madam Speaker, the high degree of secrecy around trade negotiations. So if you look at other countries, I mentioned this, I won't repeat all of it, I mentioned this in my second reading speech, Madam Speaker, but if you look at the European Union and the US, two of our biggest trading partners, which we have concluded free trade deals with, both of them release far more information about their negotiation process to the public and create far more of a space for civic engagement around trade negotiation, and allow their citizens to weigh in on what's important to them, what they think their executive is doing that's right in those negotiations, and what they think what they're doing is wrong. We saw how that interplay between the legislature and the executive can create opportunities to get better deals. We saw that happen with this very agreement. Unfortunately not here in Canada, but in the United States, where Congress was able to get involved and require the president to go back to the table in order to get a deal that was acceptable to the legislature. This Parliament only deals with trade deals once they're signed, sealed, and delivered, and there is no possibility of going back to the table, Madam Speaker. So that was why I contacted the Deputy Prime Minister early on in this process, Madam Speaker, to talk about some of those problems of process and how we might be able to improve those going forward. And that precipitated a period of negotiation, shall we say, at the end of which the government committed to put in their policy for tabling treaties in the House of Commons, a commitment that the government will now tell Parliament formally 90 days before beginning formal negotiations with another country or group of countries of its intent to bargain a new trade deal. It will table in Parliament, which means publicly, Madam Speaker, 30 days before those negotiations, its negotiating objectives. Now that's comparable to what already happens in the United States and is even less stringent than what happens in the European Union. So it's a completely reasonable thing to do, and I think Canadians will be better off for it. And finally, Madam Speaker, on the topic of the economic impact assessment, we got a commitment from government that they will make it a matter of policy that governments table economic impact assessments side by side with the ratifying legislation, so that we never again end up in the ridiculous position we were in this time, where we were being asked to study a bill without having any economic data about its impact. I shouldn't say any. We did have some from the United States, because a year ago, they published an economic impact assessment. But Canadians and their parliamentarians shouldn't have to look to our trading partners for information about how a trade deal is going to affect us. We should be able to get that from the government, and we now have a commitment to make it a matter of policy that governments will provide that information, which I think is important. I'm sorry I'm out of time. There's more I'd like to say, but I look forward to the question and answer period. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
It's the honourable member for Avalon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member of the NDP for his speech here this morning. But he mentioned a couple of things of interest. One was, he mentioned the original status of the trade agreement, and leaving it as it is probably wouldn't have been a bad thing. But has he forgotten about the tariffs that were imposed, and under that trade agreement with its lack of defining things, I guess, the tariffs that were put on aluminum, that were put on steel, that were put on wood products, paper and whatnot, he's forgotten that. And he said, he mentioned the corporate free trade deal. Well, a lot of the corporations that are in favour of this trade deal employ hundreds and thousands of people across this country, many of them unionised employees, to their benefit. So, and for me in my riding, there's a company, Ocean Choice International, which applauds the trade agreements because it enables them to open markets free of tariffs and provide good paying jobs to the people that work for that company. I wonder, can the member say whether he still supports that, or if he would just assume those corporations didn't have that ability to do in those free trade agreements?
Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm just digesting the question because I hope I was clear enough that I'm not a supporter of the original NAFTA. The NDP wasn't, and we aren't. What I was saying is that I don't like the model. I don't like the model that that agreement was signed under. I don't like the model that this agreement was signed under. And so what we have been tracking in this debate is whether overall the one agreement under a bad model is relatively speaking better than the agreement, the original agreement under a bad model. And, you know, to the extent that, yeah, of course there's lots of corporations that employ a lot of Canadians. Of course there are. That doesn't mean they can do no wrong. That doesn't mean that they're all wonderful people. That doesn't mean they're all looking out for the interests of their employees. I would refer the member to the 400,000 Canadians that have lost manufacturing jobs since the signature of the original NAFTA, including those in Oshawa who just recently had their plant closed, despite the fact they did award-winning work because that plant moved to Mexico for the sole purpose, frankly, Madam Speaker, of having low wages. And, you know, Canadian workers shouldn't be forced to compete with that. That's exactly what these deals do, and there's some relief from that for the first time in these labour provisions, and that's what we're interested to see in terms of how those play out.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Jonquière.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Jonquière. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to react to something my colleague just said. He said that the manufacturing sector is seeing a lot of job losses with the signing of NAFTA, and I don't really read the situation the same way as he does, because there is, a problem in the manufacturing sector that coincides with an increase in the Canadian dollar. And so when we look at the oil sector, it's something that, to my mind, isn't linked directly to the signing of the first NAFTA agreement. But it's that issue that affects it. And I'd like to hear my colleagues' comments on that. Well, I think that it's clear that there were a lot of job losses between 94 and 2007, 2008, when the dollar was at parity. So that could explain the more recent job losses, but it doesn't explain the many job losses in the manufacturing sector during the period between 94 and 2007.
Member for Esquimalt, Saanich Sooke.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I just want to congratulate the member for Elmwood Transcona on a very clear laying out of the NDP trade policies, and his congratulations was very effective work as our trade spokesperson. I think he doesn't take enough credit here for something I think we will regard as historic. When we look back on the changes that his work with the Deputy Prime Minister led to in the way we approach trade agreements, we're going to see this was a historic change, providing more transparency, more openness, and a role in Parliament in having input into the trade agreements instead of a last-minute yes or no, as in this case. So I wonder if the honourable member could give us some idea of how these agreements he reached with the government will apply to the upcoming trade negotiations with other countries.
Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much to my colleague for that kind question. I mean, I think one of the things, I'm going to go back a little ways to a process that some might remember around what was referred to as the Security and Prosperity Partnership. One of the really frustrating aspects about those negotiations, such as they were, and we don't know the full extent of that. In fact, in one of the minority parliaments that preceded 2011, there was an attempt to get documents just for Canadians to be able to get some basic information about what the government was doing at the negotiating table with the United States on that file. And it was a Conservative chair of the committee at that time that actually just stood up and walked out of the room lest a motion passed demanding information about what was going on at that table, Madam Speaker. So what we've negotiated with the government and what should be different is at least Canadians will know that a negotiation is taking place. Now that sounds really basic. That doesn't sound particularly exciting. It sounds like the kind of thing you'd think, well, of course we would know that. Doesn't the government always tell us? And the fact is, Madam Speaker, is that no, there is no requirement for the government to tell us. And the SPP was a great example of a time when they refused to tell us. Not only would we know that that negotiation was happening, Madam Speaker, but we would have at the very least the high-level negotiating objectives, which presumably were different for the SPP than they were for the TPP, than they were for CETA, right? So this, I think it's one of those things that is easy to understate. It sounds like, oh, well, that's not that big a deal, whatever. Weren't they always doing that? And the point is no. And for people in the Trade Justice Network and labor unions and other parts of civil society that know that these trade agreements can have a real impact on the lives of working people, not just corporate tycoons that are going to make more money, but real Canadians who have a real potential to lose out on things that matter to them in their lives. This is going to give them a window in and to know where to start looking and where to start sniffing around to find out what's going on and how it's going to affect people, whether it's members of their union or members of their organization or just ordinary Canadians whose welfare they are concerned for. So I think that's why it's a really important starting point.
Comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Madam Speaker, I am encouraged by the Deputy Prime Minister and her ability to reach out in terms of ways in which we can improve upon the system. I applaud the member's approach in terms of trying to deal with that issue. But I wouldn't want to give an impression as if all of a sudden you get a group of individuals that met in the United States with Mexico representatives and an agreement is signed off and there was no background work done to it. We know, Madam Speaker, that for months, if not years now, there have been discussions and dialogue in regards to an agreement, a potential agreement that needed to be achieved in Canada. We had industry representation from all regions of the country. We had hundreds of hours of debate, not only on this sort of discussion, but also on other trade agreements. So we shouldn't try to give Canadians a false impression that would try to imply that everyone was kind of blindsided. Even after the agreement was signed, the Deputy Prime Minister made available for the leadership of all parties to participate and gain more information. I wonder if you could just provide just a general oversight to those comments.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I know the Deputy Prime Minister has made a lot of the extent of consultation that went on, but I'll tell you, there's a big difference between consulting sector-specific people under the cloak of NDAs, or non-disclosure agreements, where they're not allowed to talk about anything, versus bringing it into Parliament, where there are things that we can discuss. There's a difference between sharing your objectives at the negotiating table with people who aren't allowed to talk about those with anybody else, and sharing them in Parliament, where the country can have a conversation about what should be on that list that's not on the list, what should be taken off the list that is on the list. And supply management is a great example, Madam Speaker, where dairy farmers are hit hard by this agreement. I hope maybe there'll be another context. We've done it a bit of committee where we've talked about some of the ways government can mitigate some of the ill effects that are part of this agreement. But certainly, Madam Speaker, I think being able to have had that debate with more information on the table, because up until 2 weeks before this version of the deal was signed, dairy farmers were told that they were going to be okay, that there wasn't significant concessions beyond what was in the original NAFTA. So yeah, people got caught off guard, and I think public debate has a way of bringing those things out. It doesn't always, it's not perfect, it's a blunt instrument, but it can really bring things out to the surface, and that's why it was such a priority for us to take the first meaningful step on a road towards a better, more transparent process, because we think in the long term that's going to help us get better deals that are fair for workers and the environment.